Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. In this lesson, we'll be analyzing the poem The Complaints of Poverty by Nicholas James. When winters rage upon the cottage falls and the wind rushes through the gaping walls, when ninepence must their daily want supply, with hunger pinched and cold, the children cry. The gathered sticks but little warmth afford, and half supplied the platter meets the board. So the complaints of poverty is Nicholas James' long outburst against the sufferings of the poor and the selfish cruelty of the upper classes in the 18th century Britain. The poem ends up sounding a lot more like an outside observer's outraged remarks on what poverty does to people. The first lines of this excerpt describe day to day life for a poor family in 18th century Britain. When winter's rage comes along, the speaker says, in a moment of personification that suggests the very seasons are cruel to the poor. So an already difficult situation gets even worse. So when winters come along, when they're raging and they're coming along, so what happens to the poor? The poor lives which are already very difficult, they become even more worse, even more difficult, even worse. So besides cold winds that rush through the gaping, cracked open walls of the poor cottages, both food and fuel become scarce. Living on a trivial ninepence, families cannot afford to feed their children. The speaker evokes this dilemma through straightforward, resentful imagery. क्या है वो imagery? With hunger pinched and cold, the children cry. The gathered sticks but little warmth afford, and half supplied the platter meets the board. The image of children who are pinched by hunger and who are cold, it suggests both that the children look strained, as in starved, and that they feel as if they have been pinched by their hunger pangs and the cruel nippy winds. The half supplied minimal plate their parents can provide them isn't nearly enough to fill their bellies or keep the cold from their little bones. There is powerful anaphora that you're going to find over here. When winters rage upon the cottage falls, when ninepence must their daily want supply. Okay, so the repeated when here feels ugly, suggesting that these sufferings come around every winter, horribly predictable. Returned at night, if wholesome wines fail, he from the pipe extracts a smoky meal, and when to gather strength and still his woes, he seeks his last redress in soft repose. The tattered blanket urges the flea's retreat, denies his shivering limbs sufficient heat. Teased with the squalling babes' nocturnal cries, he, restless, on the dusty pillow lies. Now the father of the family comes home. His children were already eating from a half supplied plate. Now there are no wholesome viands and nourishing foods whatsoever left for him. Instead, he has to manage with the smoky meal yani कि of a pipe's worth of tobacco, which is a metaphor that stresses just how insubstantial and unsatisfying such an airy dinner would be, in which he has to smoke the pipe. So, hungry and troubled by woes, it is not easy to watch your children cry from cold and hunger. After all, this man tries to find a last redress in soft repose. Yani कि in other words, he tries to escape from his sufferings into a peaceful sleep. Surely the speaker invites readers to think. Sleep is one pleasure you do not need money to enjoy. वो तो गरीब भी कर सकता है. But that is not the case. With sufficient and filthy bedding, a whole swarm of fleas, yani कि bugs for company, and the sound of the kids crying in his ears, there is no hope for this man. He cannot even sleep peacefully at night. He would have to lie awake all night. There is something particularly painful and insulting about being so impoverished that you cannot even sleep. The sleep which is free for everyone. But this poverty would not even let you, this misery would not even let you sleep, which is free for everyone. The imagery of the tattered blanket and dusty pillow makes it clear that the simplest comforts are denied to this unhappy man, and that the insults of poverty extend even to the most private corners of his life, his sleep as well. So the speaker describes this dreadful predicament. okay, na, is the same for all kinds of struggling people. Line 15 to 20. But when pale sickness wounds with direful blow, words but imperfectly his misery show, unskillful how to treat the fierce disease, well-meaning ignorance curtains our days, in a dark room and miserable bed, together lie the living and the dead. Oof. Ordinary daily life is hard enough for that poor everyman, the speaker goes on. But when he gets ill, words but imperfectly his misery show. The speaker cannot even describe how the bad the man's life gets. Despite attempts to express the suffering through words, they fall short in capturing the full extent of the misery. This suggests that the experience of sickness and pain transcends mere language and cannot be adequately conveyed through words alone. Here, illness is personified as a cruel figure, a pale being that a pale being that wounds with direful or dreadful blow, violently striking the unfortunate man. Like the earlier personification of winter, this metaphor suggests that the world is actively cruel to the poor. The indifferent turn of the seasons and the random bad luck of illness, in other words, feel like conscious enemies when one is already dealing with the desperate poverty. So, facing illness without any money, the speaker suggests, means having to rely on well meaning ignorance. यानी कि the kindly intended but untrained assistance of friends or neighbors rather than professional help from a doctor. क्या कहा है? It when facing illness without any money, the speaker suggests means having to rely on a well-meaning ignorance. यानी कि well-meaning तो कौन हो गया? Kindly intended हो गया. But ignorance यानी कि untrained assistance of friends or neighbors. A person who's poor, he has to rely on kind intended untrained assistance of friends or neighbors rather than the professional help from a doctor because they cannot afford doctors. Because these folks are unskillful how to treat the fierce disease, their attempts to help can only curtail our days, yani ke shorten sufferers' lives. And it's going to make their lives even more difficult if they are being assisted with people who are completely untrained about that fierce disease. And even worse is, in a dark room and miserable bed, together lie the living and the dead. These lines present an appalling situation in the plainest language possible. This distressing image portrays the bleakness of sickness and death. The dark room symbolizes the gloom and despair that often accompany illness, while the miserable bed represents the suffering and discomfort. The juxtaposition of the living and the dead in the same space evokes a sense of hopelessness and inevitability, emphasizing the indiscriminate nature of sickness and mortality. Oh, shocking scene! Fate sweeps whole tribes away and frees the parish of the reluctant pay. Where is the physician now, whom heaven ordains fate to arrest and check corroding pains? Or he is obtained by, or he is detained by those of high degree, or won't prescribe without a golden fee. Oh, shocking scene, the speaker cries, expressing what may well be the reader's own feelings after encountering the image of the sick forced to lie in the same narrow bed as the dead bodies of their families. The poem swiftly channels that shock into outrage. Fate sweeps whole tribes away and frees the parish of the reluctant pay. The harsh P alliteration there in parish and pay makes it sound as if the speaker is practically spitting as he denouncing the parish, the local church office. The officials there might not be so shocked by the grim and untimely deaths as the reader and the speaker these lines suggest. They might rather be relieved not to have to dispense the ungenerous and unwilling financial help they offered to those now dead families. They'll be relieved कि भाई अब there won't be many people. अब बंदों बंदों का नंबर कम हो गया जिनको हमें पैसे देने पड़ेंगे, फाइनेंशियल हेल्प देनी पड़ेगी. So those supposedly charitable institutions the speaker implies are definitely not doing their job. Nor are the doctors. Doctors भी अपना job नहीं कर रहे. There is the physician now, whom heaven ordains paid to arrest and check corroding pains. Or he is detained by those of high degree or won't prescribe without a golden fee. So like the clergy, like the parish, like the church, the speaker feels doctors are ordained to their task. That is, they have God given responsibility. They have been commanded, ordered by the God. The responsibility has been given to them by God to ease suffering wherever they find it, to stand up to the cruel fate that wipes out whole families. But these doctors, like the churches, seem more interested in their own wealth than the good of the people they should be serving. Rather than soothing the corroding, devouring agonies of poor people's illnesses, they dash off to tend to those of high degree, that is, people of higher social status. They are unwilling to treat anyone who cannot offer them a golden fee, a hefty payment. So either they'll be found with people of higher social status, या फिर they will be unwilling to treat anyone without the golden fee, यानी कि hefty payment. So all the people who should be helping the poor, in other words, are instead looking out for themselves, trying to keep their own pockets lined. Not just indifferent fate, but a greedy and snobbish society condemn the poor to their hard lives and the miserable death. यानी कि only fate must not be given the क्या कहते हैं must not be blamed, okay, but it is also the society and the people living in the society who should be blamed for the hard lives and the miserable deaths of the poor in the society. Lines 27 to 32. But should old age bring on its reverend hoar? When strength decayed admits his toil no more, he begs itinerant with halting pace and mournful tells his melancholy case. With meagre cheek and formidable beard, a tattered dress of various rags prepared. So if the poor every man whose life the poem has been tracing makes it through years of hunger, cold, and sickness to old age. यानी कि any man, any poor person who somehow survived the hunger, cold, and sickness, and he has gone on to the old age. The speaker continues, his troubles will still won't be over. In his old life also, his trouble won't be over. In fact, it is the opposite. His problems will get even worse since his decade strength will no longer allow him to work. Describing the old man's horror, yani कि white-haired head, the speaker reminds readers that the white hair of an old age should be treated as a reverend, as an honorable person, as a respectable person. The elderly should be respected and cared for. Instead, too weak for labor, this poor man has no choice but to become a wandering beggar. क्योंकि काम तो कर नहीं सकते old age में, so he'll be limping sadly from one place to another, telling his tales of woe and his pain, asking or showing, telling his others the tales or stories of his pain, his difficulties, so that he can get some times out of it. He is in bad shape, with meager cheek and formidable beard, a tattered dress of various rags prepared. The imagery in this passage paints a poignant picture of intense neglect. Besides his ragged clothing, this poor man doesn't even have the resources for a shave. His formidable beard is unkempt and overgrown. His meager, yani कि thin cheek, reveals that he is as hungry now as he's ever been. Notice the alliteration the speaker uses in this passage. All the drawn out M sounds in mournful, melancholy, and meager make the lines hum with sad music. With this, we're going to move on to the next lines. Base covetous, who wants the soul to give, directs the road with richer neighbor live. Directs the road where base covetous, who wants the soul to give, directs the road where richer neighbor live. And pride and unmindful of its parent dust, stays with the dungeon and the whipping poor. Now he turns to these unfortunate people's neighbors. Yani ke the poor people, they turn to their neighbors, the people whom one might hope would want to help them out in their sufferings. Base covetous who wants the soul to give directs the road where richer neighbors live. So confronted with a sad, starving elderly beggar, base covetous, yani ke lowly greed here serving as a metonym for lowly greedy people. Base covetous, yani कि lowly greed. And what does the lowly greed symbolize? It is serving as a means of lowly, symbolizing lowly greedy people. हालांकि base covetous is lowly greed. So when lowly greed represents the lowly greedy people, that kind of literary device is known as metonym. Metonym. Just like when, um just like when uh, the White House, क्या कहते हैं, the White House has commanded this. तो इसका क्या मीनिंग होता है, यानी कि the person sitting in the White House has commanded it. So White House is symbolifying the president himself. So over here, base covetous, the lowly greed is actually symbolifying the lowly greedy people. Okay, which is a metonym. So this just points the way to its wealthier neighbors' houses down the street. And when the elderly beggar goes on to the base covetous, yani कि the lowly greedy people who happens to be their neighbors, these neighbors then address and direct them to their wealthier neighbors' houses down the street. Metonymy is a type of figurative language in which an object is referred to not by its own name, but instead by the name of something closely associated with it. For example, Wall Street is a metonym for the entire American financial industry. So if the old man follows these selfish neighbors' directions and goes down the road to the homes of the wealthy, he won't find what he's looking for over there as well. And pride, unmindful of its parent dust, scales with dungeon and the whipping post. Pride, another metonym, this time for arrogant and proud people, is even crueler to the old man. Yani ke these arrogant and proud people, they are even crueler to the old man than the merely selfish neighbors were. Rather than just turning him away, what do? They threaten to treat him like an outright criminal, to imprison him, or to whip him for begging. They react this way, the speaker says, because they are unmindful of their parenters. This line alludes to the language from the Bible and from the Book of Common Prayer, the official prayer book of the Church of England, Britain's state church, during the 18th century when he was writing this poem. So, in the biblical creation story, God is said to make Adam from the dust of the earth. And the burial service in the Book of Common Prayer reminds mourners that everyone comes from earth and returns to the earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. So in other words, the arrogant people who treat the poor like dirt have forgotten that the poor are people just like them. All people, this moment suggests, share an important essential equality because all of them have come from dirt. To be human is to have needs, to suffer, and to die someday. In pushing the poor away and treating them like criminals, this poem's outraged speaker suggests the prideful and greedy are forgetting that their shared humanity. They're forgetting their own role as human beings. They're forgetting that they're equal to those poor beggars. With this, we're going to move on to the themes of this poem. The theme happened to be class, poverty, and injustice. So the outraged speaker of the complaints of poverty protests strongly against the terrible sufferings of England's impoverished people in the 18th century. To be poor, this speaker says, is not just to experience all kinds of pains and dignities, but to be rejected and mistreated by the rest of the world. In this poem, the speaker describes impoverished people's hard day-to-day lives and their painful deaths, and observes as well that the wealthier people who should be helping them are seriously neglecting their duty. That's why it is injustice. Okay, the poetic devices, we have already done imagery, metaphor, and anaphora and alliteration. With this, we're going to move on to the form of the poem. Now, this excerpt, yani ke, the poem, the complaints of poverty, is a lengthy poem. But over here in our syllabus are the 36 lines. So the excerpt covered in this poem is 36 lines long. But the complete poem goes on considerably longer. So, written in formal heroic couplets, that is, paid rhyming lines of iambic. So, popular since Chaucer, this form was especially prominent during the 17th and 18th centuries when poets like John Dryden and Alexander Pope adopted it for their satires and classic translations. In choosing this form, James marks himself out as a skilled and educated man, someone whom the sort of people who read stylish, refined verse and who could probably be digging a little deeper into their pockets should listen to. Yani ke, he has used this form, which is a very educated form of the elite people, so that the educated and elite people would read this poem in this stylish form, and after reading this, realize and recognize their duty towards the poor people. The meter. The complaints of poverty is written in heroic couplets and it is paid rhyming lines of iambic pentameter. This is a poem meant to make a political point. Meaning it doing this, the poem is meant to make a political point. Okay, and that has already been suggested in the form. Rhyme scheme. The complaints of poverty is written in couplets and its rhyme scheme runs A, B, B, C, C, and so on. Couplets often feel quick and orderly, and here they support the feeling that the speaker is making a thorough and well considered argument against the appalling conditions the poor live in. The setting. The poem is set in poet Nicholas James' own time and place, England in the mid 18th century. This, as James observes, was a time meant to be poor, often meant to suffer horribly, to live in cold, cramped, and unsanitary lodgings, to go without sufficient food, and to die uncared for. Literary context. Scholars know very little about Nicholas James, the author of this poem, not even his dates of birth and death. His name and his work survive in a single published volume, Poems on Several Occasions. What we can say about James is that he lived in and clearly responded strongly to the Enlightenment era, which was a period of revolutionary social and philosophical change. Enlightenment thinkers, motivated by a deep belief in the power of reason, began to question ancient certainties from the rightful order of society to the existence of God. So, James was a man of his era, a person not afraid to question and satirize the culture in which he lived, but where his contemporaries like Alexander Pope styled their social critiques with lofty, elegant wit. So the complaints of poverty takes a more direct approach, railing against the sufferings of the poor and the indifference of the rich. Historical context. As James observes, 18th century Britain was a rough time and place for the poor, and a lot of people were poor at that time. A population explosion across the 18th century meant that British cities were severely overcrowded, filthy, and broke for resources. A severe grain shortage didn't help matters. Poverty was common, and there was little support for the poor people. These stressful and depressing conditions brewed discontent and rebellion. The struggles of the poor across Europe during this era would eventually contribute to massive political change, even the revolution. The French Revolution itself ran on the fuel of working people's fury against the tiny and lavishly wealthy upper class. With this, we're going to complete this poem. If there are any questions, please feel free to ask.